May 12th, 1945. A train pulls into a small English village carrying 200 German soldiers. They're exhausted, starving, and they're expecting the worst. Through the wooden slats they can see green fields, hear birds singing, smell fresh rain. It's peaceful. Too peaceful. The door slides open and British guards gesture them out. Here's the thing. What happens next is going to sound impossible. These men just spent 6 years at war, and now they're about to do something nobody saw coming. They're about to help feed the very country they'd been fighting against. And one of these prisoners? He's about to change one British farmer's life forever. This is the story nobody talks about from World War II. Before we dive in, smash that like button and subscribe, because what I'm about to tell you is one of those stories that'll completely change how you see history. And trust me, you don't want to miss where this goes. Hit that notification bell too, because I've got more of these untold stories coming. All right, let's get into it. The soldiers stepped off that train one by one, blinking in the morning light. They'd been crammed in those wooden carriages for hours, and honestly, they didn't know what to expect. Some figured they'd be met with fists, maybe worse. They'd heard stories about what happened to prisoners, but instead, British guards just gestured them into lines and started walking them down this narrow country lane. And get this, the place looked untouched by war. Hedgerows were blooming with hawthorn, birds were singing, the air smelled like rain and fresh earth. It felt surreal after years of bombed-out cities and muddy trenches. As they walked through the village, farm workers stopped to watch them pass. The Germans kept their eyes down, bracing themselves for anger, for shouting, for something. But there was nothing, just the sound of boots on gravel and cattle in the distance. It was almost eerie how quiet it was. Here's what you've got to understand about Britain in 1945. The country was stretched impossibly thin. They'd taken in hundreds of thousands of German and Italian prisoners by that point, and the camps were overflowing. Meanwhile, the farms were in crisis mode. Most of the young men were still overseas, and the Women's Land Army had been doing incredible work, but it wasn't enough. The harvest couldn't wait for anyone. So the government made a call that a lot of people couldn't wrap their heads around. They decided to send these soldiers out to work the fields. Let them help feed the country. When you think about it, it sounds absolutely insane. But desperation changes things, right? In Ashwell, the prisoners got set up in this old manor house on the edge of town. It was draughty, cold, but it had beds and a roof. That first night, they got soup and bread. It wasn't much, but some of these guys hadn't eaten a real meal in weeks. A few of the older men just sat there crying quietly. They'd made it through the war. Now they just wanted to make it through whatever came next. Listen, the village was split on the whole thing. Some locals thought it was wrong to show any kindness to these men. Others didn't care one way or the other. They just needed the crops planted and the work done. The prisoners were here whether anyone liked it or not. Thomas Whitley was 62 years old, with a back bent from decades of farm work and hands that looked like tree roots. He'd lost his son at Dunkirk. His wife had passed 2 years earlier. Now he was managing his 100-acre farm alone, just him and the land. When the official told him he'd be getting 4 German prisoners to help with the spring planting, Whitley didn't say a word. He just nodded, climbed into his truck, and waited for them to load up. The drive to his farm took about 15 minutes. Nobody spoke. The 4 Germans sat in the back watching the countryside roll past, and Whitley kept his eyes on the road. When they pulled up to the property, he pointed to the barn, the tools, the field that needed ploughing. That's it. No welcome, no instructions, just pointing. One of the prisoners stepped forward. His name was Klaus Richter, 31 years old, thin as a rail with hollow, exhausted eyes. In careful, broken English, he asked what Whitley wanted done. Whitley looked at him for a long moment. Then, he said, they'd start with the north field. He showed them the plough, the harness for the horses. Richter nodded. Turns out he'd grown up on a farm in Bavaria. He actually knew this work. The other three guys? City boys, clumsy with the equipment, fumbling around. But Richter taught them. By midday, they'd turned 3 acres. Whitley watched from the gate, and honestly, he was surprised. They worked hard, no complaining, no slacking off, just steady work. At noon, Whitley's daughter Margaret showed up with lunch. She was 18, fair-haired, and careful. She'd been 15 when the war started. She'd grown up hearing about the enemy, about what they'd done, what they were capable of. Now here they were, sitting in her father's field, eating bread and cheese she'd packed that morning. She set the basket down without saying a word and walked straight back to the house. But here's the thing, she'd seen their faces, up close, and they didn't look like what she'd imagined. They looked tired, young, just human. Over the next few weeks, a routine started to form. The prisoners showed up at dawn, worked until dusk. Whitley didn't pay them directly, that wasn't allowed, but he made sure they ate. Sometimes Margaret brought extra food. Nobody talked much at first, but slowly things started shifting. Richter began teaching the other prisoners English words: plough, seed, rain, basic stuff. And Whitley, surprisingly, picked up a few German phrases in return. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't even trust yet. But it was something. A working understanding, maybe. In the village, people had opinions. Some thought it was wrong to show these men any kindness at all. Others saw it practically. The work needed doing, and the prisoners were here whether anyone liked it or not. But here's what's interesting. Gradually, without anyone really noticing, things started to change. Kids, playing near the fields, would wave as the prisoners walked by. A few farmers started inviting them inside for tea during breaks. Get this. There was this elderly woman, Mrs. Patterson. She'd lost her husband in the First War. Every Sunday she'd show up with cake for the prisoners. Just brought it over like it was the most natural thing in the world. She knew what it meant to be far from home. By summer, the prisoners weren't just working Whitley's farm anymore. They were spread across a dozen farms in the area, harvesting wheat, tending livestock, fixing fences. Some of them had been engineers or tradesmen before the war, so they helped repair machinery. A couple had medical training and started assisting the village doctor when the clinic got overwhelmed. Listen, the boundaries started to blur. They were still prisoners, still guarded, still technically the enemy. But they were also becoming something else, familiar. You'd see them around, and after a while they were just part of the scenery. Richter became sort of a fixture at the Whitley farm. He worked harder than anyone else, showing up early, staying late, never cutting corners. The relationship between him and the family grew closer over time. But here's what nobody knew. Richter had a wife and 2 daughters back in Germany. He hadn't heard from them in over a year. Had no idea if they were alive, if the house was still standing, if they'd made it through the bombing. Nothing. Margaret started noticing things. The way his hands would shake sometimes when he thought no one was watching. How he'd go quiet during breaks, staring off at nothing. One afternoon, she did something remarkable. She wrote him a letter in simple English. Took her time with it, kept the words basic so he could understand. It said that when the war ended, if he needed help finding his family, she'd try to assist him however she could. Richter read that letter 3 times. Just stood there in the barn, reading it over and over. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. He thanked her in German, his voice thick. Margaret didn't understand the words, but she understood what they meant. You could see it in his face. Listen, not everything was peaceful. In the neighbouring village of Royston, one of the prisoners tried to make a run for it. He got caught within hours, cold and starving, hiding in some farmer's barn. They shipped him off to a harsher camp up north. That whole incident reminded everyone that these men were still prisoners, that the situation, no matter how comfortable it seemed, wasn't normal. Some villagers never softened up. They saw the prisoners as a necessary thing to tolerate, nothing more. But others, they saw something different, just men trying to survive. By autumn, the war in Europe had been over for months. Japan had surrendered in August. The world was trying to piece itself back together, but the prisoners stayed put. Repatriation was moving at a crawl. Germany was in ruins, borders had shifted, families were scattered across refugee camps and bombed-out cities. A lot of these men didn't even know where home was anymore. The town they'd left didn't exist. The street address meant nothing now, and so they stayed in Britain, working, waiting. Richter kept showing up at Whitley's farm every morning like clockwork. That year's harvest was one of the best the farm had seen in a decade. Whitley credited the extra hands, but it was more than that. Richter had this quiet determination about him. He treated the land like it mattered, like it was his own. Here's the thing. Somewhere along the way, the dynamic had shifted. Richter wasn't just labour anymore. When a fence needed mending, Whitley would ask his opinion. When they were planning which field to rotate for spring planting, they'd walk the property together discussing it, actually planning together like partners. It wasn't something they'd talked about or decided. It just happened. The routine had become comfortable, familiar. Richter would arrive before dawn, help with the morning milking, then move on to whatever needed doing that day. Margaret still brought lunch most days. Sometimes she'd stay and eat with them, telling stories about the village gossip or complaining about rationing. Richter's English had gotten a lot better. He could follow conversations now, even make jokes sometimes. His laugh was quiet, but it was there. November came in cold that year. Frost on the ground most mornings, your breath hanging in the air. One morning a letter arrived at the manor house where the prisoners were billeted. It had Richter's name on it. The thing had taken months to reach him. You could see all the stamps and redirections on the envelope. Passed through Red Cross offices, military channels, probably sat in some sorting facility for weeks. Richter's hands were shaking when they gave it to him. He just stood there in the common room, staring at the envelope like he was afraid to open it. Because here's what he was thinking. If it was bad news, if they were gone, then, as long as he didn't open it, he could still hope. One of the other prisoners had to tell him to sit down. He opened it carefully, tearing along the edge so he wouldn't damage anything inside. The letter was in his wife's handwriting. He recognized it immediately. She always wrote with this neat, careful script. His eyes scanned the first line, and something in his face just broke. They were alive. His wife Anna and both daughters, Greta and Liesel. They'd survived the bombing of Munich. Barely. Their apartment building had been hit, but they'd been in the shelter. They'd lost everything. Photos, clothes, all of it. But they'd gotten out. They'd fled south with thousands of others, ended up in a small village near the Austrian border. They were living with Anna's cousin in a house with no heat and not much food, thin, struggling, scared, but breathing, alive. Richter read the letter 3 times, his vision blurring. Then he just sat there with it in his hands. The other prisoners left him alone. You didn't intrude on something like that. After a while, he got up and walked outside. It was maybe 6:30 in the morning, still mostly dark. He walked the half-mile to Whitley's farm like he did every day, but this time his legs felt shaky. When he got there, he couldn't work. He tried, picked up a rake, started cleaning out one of the stalls, but his hands wouldn't stop trembling. He kept having to stop and just breathe. Eventually he gave up and sat down on the barn's step, the letter still folded in his pocket. That's where Whitley found him about an hour later. Richter was just sitting there, hunched over, his face in his hands, not making any sound, but his shoulders were shaking. Whitley stopped a few feet away. He didn't ask what happened, didn't say anything at all. He just walked over, placed one rough hand on Richter's shoulder, and left it there for a moment. Then he went back to his work, leaving Richter alone with whatever he was feeling, that overwhelming mix of grief and relief that doesn't have a name. Christmas 1945 was strange. The prisoners were allowed to attend a small service at the village church. Some locals weren't happy about it. There were arguments, people threatening to boycott. But the vicar stood firm. He preached about forgiveness, about the long road everyone still had ahead of them, about how hate was easy and grace was hard, but that's what made it worth something. Richter sat in the back row with his cap in his hands, not really following all the English, but understanding the feeling of it. Margaret was 3 rows ahead with her father. She kept glancing back, not sure why. After the service, people filed out into the cold December air, their breath visible in little clouds. Most folks headed straight home. But Margaret stayed. She stood there on the church steps, shifting from foot to foot, clutching something wrapped in brown paper. When Richter came out, she approached him. Her cheeks were red from the cold, or maybe from nerves. She held out the package. It was a scarf she'd knitted. Dark grey wool, simple pattern, but you could tell she'd put time into it. She said it was cold, that he'd need it for working in the fields. Her voice was quiet, almost apologetic, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to do this. Get this. Richter's eyes got wet. He took the scarf carefully, like it was made of glass. He wrapped it around his neck right there, even though it wasn't that cold yet. Then he told her in his broken English that she had a kind heart, that the world needed more people like her. His voice cracked on the words. Margaret didn't know what to say, so she just nodded and walked back to where her father was waiting. Whitley had seen the whole thing. He didn't say anything, but his expression had softened. The weeks after Christmas felt heavy. Everyone knew the repatriation orders were coming soon. You could feel it in the air. Early 1946, the official notice finally arrived. Richter and the others would be heading back to Germany in stages. Mixed feelings all around, relief that they'd survived, dread about what they'd find when they got home. The night before Richter left, Whitley did something he hadn't done before. He invited him into the house, not just the kitchen or the mudroom, the actual house. They sat in the front room by the fire with cups of weak tea. That's all anyone had back then, tea so weak you could see through it. For a while, neither of them said anything, just sat there watching the flames, listening to the wood pop and settle. Then Whitley started talking. He told Richter about his son, about getting the telegram from Dunkirk, how he'd crumpled it up and thrown it across the room because if he didn't look at it, maybe it wasn't real. He talked about the months after, how he'd hated Germans with everything he had, how that hate was the only thing that felt solid when everything else was falling apart. But meeting Richter had changed something, he said. Didn't erase the loss. Nothing could do that. Didn't make it hurt less. But it softened it somehow. Made it possible to see past the uniform and the flag to just a person. Another father. Another man trying to get through. Richter listened, his tea going cold in his hands. Then he started talking about his own brother. Younger by 3 years, always laughing, terrible at cards, lost on the Eastern Front in the winter of 43. How Richter had gotten the news while he was in a trench in France, and he'd just kept digging because what else was there to do? He talked about the waste of it all. 2 brothers gone, Whitley's son gone, millions of others. And for what? Neither of them had wanted this war. Neither of them had chosen it. They sat there in silence for a long time after that. The fire burned down to embers. Outside, the night was quiet except for the occasional hoot of an owl. Two men who'd been on opposite sides of a finished fight, just sitting together in a farmhouse in England, connected by the same grief and the same exhaustion. The next morning came too fast. Dawn broke cold and grey. The trucks arrived at 7 a.m., engines rumbling in the quiet. Richter and the other prisoners gathered their few belongings, not much to show for nearly a year in England. A small group of villagers had gathered near the manor house to watch them leave. Not everyone, but more than you'd expect. A few people waved. Some just stood there with their arms crossed, watching. Mrs. Patterson was there, of course. She pressed parcels of food into each prisoner's hands as they climbed into the trucks. Bread, some cheese, a few apples. "For the journey," she kept saying, patting their arms like they were her own sons heading off somewhere. Margaret stood next to her father near the back of the small crowd. She was wearing that same scarf she'd made for Richter, the one she'd given him at Christmas. He'd tried to return it that morning, said she should keep it. But she'd refused, told him his daughters would want to see it someday. So she'd knitted herself another one, identical. Now she wore it wrapped tight against the cold. Richter was one of the last to board. He paused at the truck, looking back at the village, at the fields, at the people who'd somehow stopped being strangers. His eyes found Margaret and Whitley. He nodded slowly, deliberately. Margaret nodded back, her throat tight. Whitley raised his hand just slightly, not quite a wave, just an acknowledgement. Then Richter climbed into the truck bed with the others. The engine revved, gears ground, and the trucks pulled away, rumbling down that same narrow lane they'd walked almost a year before, heading back toward the railway station. A few people stayed watching until the trucks disappeared around the bend. Richter made it back to Germany in late February 1946. What he found wasn't really home anymore. His street in Munich was rubble, just piles of brick and twisted metal where houses used to be. But his family was alive, and that's what mattered. They were living in that village near the Austrian border, crammed into Anna's cousin's tiny house with about a dozen other people. No privacy, barely any food, winters so cold you could see your breath inside. They rebuilt slowly. Richter found work doing manual labour, clearing debris, helping construct temporary housing. The economy was destroyed. Money was basically worthless. People traded things instead. A day's work for a bag of potatoes, a repaired roof for some firewood. It was survival mode, nothing more. But he never forgot Ashwell. A few months after getting back, he managed to get a letter out to the Whitleys. Took him forever to write it because his English wasn't great on paper. He kept it short, just thanked them for their kindness, said he was with his family, hoped they were well. That kind of thing. Whitley wrote back. His letter was short, too, just a few lines saying he was glad Richter had found his family safe. They exchanged a few more letters over the years. Nothing frequent, nothing deep, just occasional updates. Richter would mention that Greta had started school, or that they'd finally gotten their own apartment. Whitley would write about the farm, about Margaret getting married, about the new tractor he'd managed to buy. Years passed. Richter worked construction, saved every penny he could. The German economy slowly started recovering. By the mid-1950s, things weren't good, but they were better, more stable. And Richter had this idea that wouldn't leave him alone. He wanted to see the farm again, wanted to thank Whitley properly, face to face. So he saved, put away money for years. In 1958, he finally had enough for the trip. He didn't write ahead to tell them he was coming, wasn't even sure they'd remember him after 13 years. But he got on a train, then a ferry, then another train, made his way back to Ashwell. It was a warm July afternoon when he walked up that lane to Whitley's farm. The hedgerows were thick with summer growth, birds everywhere, the smell of hay in the air. Everything looked smaller than he remembered, the way places do when you come back after a long time. Whitley was in the yard working on some piece of equipment. He was 75 now, moving slower, his back more bent than before. He looked up when he heard footsteps on the gravel, squinted at the man walking toward him. Didn't recognize him at first, just saw a stranger in decent clothes, clean-shaven, healthy-looking. Then Richter smiled, that same quiet smile. And something clicked in Whitley's face. His eyes went wide. His mouth opened, but nothing came out for a second. Then he said Richter's name, more like a question than a statement. Richter nodded. Get this. Whitley dropped the wrench he was holding. Just let it fall right there in the dirt. And he walked over and wrapped his arms around Richter. These two old men standing in a farmyard in the middle of England, holding on to each other like they'd found something they'd thought was lost forever. Former enemies, now just friends. Richter stayed for a week. He helped with the harvest, just like the old days, though both of them moved a lot slower now. Margaret came over for dinner one night with her husband and 2 kids. She was 31 now, more confident, but she still had that same careful kindness about her. Her kids were fascinated by this German man with the thick accent who their grandfather kept hugging. They talked about everything, about how Germany was rebuilding, about Richter's daughters growing up, about the farm's good years and bad years. They talked about the war too, but only a little. Mostly they talked about life, about the future, about grandchildren and crops and all the ordinary things that matter when you get to a certain age. On Richter's last day, the 2 of them walked out to the north field, the same one they'd ploughed together back in 1945. The wheat was tall and golden, swaying in the breeze, ready for harvest. They stood there at the edge of the field, just looking. Whitley said it was the same field, same soil, but everything else had changed. Richter agreed. Everything had changed. Listen, this wasn't just a story about Whitley and Richter. Similar things were happening all across Britain. Thousands of German and Italian prisoners worked the land during and after the war. Some went home and never looked back. Couldn't wait to leave, didn't want any reminders of those years. But others kept those connections alive. Letters back and forth for decades. A few even settled in Britain permanently, married local women, raised families in the country they'd once fought against. It wasn't always easy. Memories were long. The pain was real. You couldn't just erase what had happened, couldn't pretend the war hadn't taken everything from so many people. But in those quiet spaces between bitterness and forgiveness, something human managed to survive. Richter came back to visit 3 more times after that first trip in 1958. Each time, he and Whitley would work the fields together, moving slower each year, their conversations getting quieter but deeper. In 1967, Thomas Whitley passed away. He was 84, still living on that farm, still working it until the very end. Richter couldn't make it to the funeral. He was dealing with health issues of his own by then. But he sent a letter. Margaret stood up at the service and read it out loud to everyone gathered there. Her voice shook a little, but she made it through. The letter talked about gratitude, about the kindness shown to a man who'd expected none, about how Margaret's scarf, that grey wool scarf from Christmas 1945, was still in his home. His daughters had kept it all these years, wrapped carefully in tissue paper. It was one of the few things they'd held on to through everything. But here's the line that stuck with everyone who heard it. Richter wrote that the war had taken so much from him, his youth, his country in a way, his certainty about anything, but it had also given him something he never expected, the knowledge that even after everything, people could choose mercy over hatred, that a British farmer could look at a broken German soldier and see not an enemy, but just another man trying to find his way home. The fields around Ashwell still grow wheat. That barn where Richter first picked up a plough back in 1945? It's still standing. Been repaired and repainted over the years, but it's the same structure. The village has changed, the way all places do. Most of the people who were there in 1945 are gone now, but the story remains. Passed down in letters kept in attic boxes, in old photographs of men standing side by side in a field with their sleeves rolled up, their faces tired but peaceful. It wasn't a grand story. No battles were fought in Ashwell, no treaties were signed, no monuments built, just a quiet chapter in a vast, terrible war. A chapter about prisoners and farmers, about suspicion slowly giving way to respect, about the small, stubborn acts of kindness that somehow persist even when the world's tearing itself apart. And about two men who were born enemies, who could have stayed enemies, who had every reason to hate each other. But they discovered something important. Hatred was a choice, and so was its opposite. So, what do you think? Could you have done what Whitley did? What Margaret did? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I actually read them. And if this story hit you the way it hit me, smash that like button and subscribe for more untold history that'll change how you see the world. I'll catch you in the next one.